Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this panel, Death with True Dignity. My name is David Lantigua. I teach theology and ethics here at the University of Notre Dame. And it's my privilege to introduce our speakers for this panel, who I will introduce in order of presentation. But before I do that, I just want to make a quick general announcement for all of you. That for those of you who have registered for the meals, you can make your way to the South Dining Hall for lunch immediately after this session. There's a map in the front of your program, and student volunteers will be driving golf carts for anyone who might like their assistance. Alistair McIntyre's presentation, which is a highlight, of course, of these conferences, will begin promptly at 1:30 in the Morris Inn Ballroom, which is where the event took place for last night's keynote. So our first speaker is Ethan Schimmeler, and Ethan is a family medicine resident physician at Memorial Hospital, which is just down the street. 2 of my children were born there, so I'm quite fond of the place.
I didn't deliver.
He did not. He earned his medical degree from the University of Cincinnati, and he also has an MA in bioethics from the Ohio State University. His research has centered upon theology and medicine at the end of life. And as a resident physician, his clinical responsibilities include ongoing training in full-spectrum family medicine from the womb to the tomb. So welcome, Dr. Schimmeler. Next, we have Randall Smith from the University of St. Thomas, who is no stranger to Notre Dame or these conferences. Randall is the Scanlon Foundation Endowed Chair in Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He also teaches regularly in the university's interdisciplinary honors program. He earned his BA in chemistry at Cornell College, where he studied the history and philosophy of science, and he earned an MA in theology at the University of Dallas, and an MMS and a PhD at the University of Notre Dame. He's served as the president of CatholicThinkers.com, previously known as the International Catholic University, since 2014, and he's served on the board of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars since 2019. His interests include moral theology, patristic and medieval theology, ancient medieval philosophy, theology and science, and he regularly gives talks at these conferences on these and other topics. So welcome, Dr. Smith. And last, we have Dr. Audra Goodnight from Villanova University. Audra is an assistant teaching professor in the ethics program at Villanova University, a very competitive position, so congratulations on that. Her primary teaching responsibilities include a foundational ethics course called The Good Life and an ethics of disability course. Audra earned her PhD from St. Louis University under the guidance of Dr. Eleanor Stump. Her primary areas of research include the ethics of disability and human flourishing, along with research on end-of-life decision-making. At this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Schimmeler.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I have no disclosures to start. This is how you traditionally start a presentation in medicine. No financial disclosures to start us off here. I do have professional and moral disclosures, I guess you could say, though. As a physician, I have a professional disclosure that I think that a physician should never be involved in the intentional hastening of life of a patient, and as a moral disclosure that one ought never to assist someone in committing their suicide. So, on to the paper. Death with dignity became a public catchphrase with the 1997 legalization of physician-assisted suicide in Oregon. Thanks to work of advocacy groups and bioethicists, terminally ill, competent adults have the right to request a physician to prescribe lethal medication for self-administration. The provocatively titled Death with Dignity Act makes its implications clear. At least for some patients, a dignified death is not possible without assisted suicide. And who would be so cruel as to cage a terminally ill adult in their indignity? However radical such assumptions may be, especially for traditional Christians, they shed light on the form of bioethics after God. Indeed, the meaning of dignity and how to respect it are ambiguous at best when it comes to end-of-life public discourse. Not only that, but the sense of human dignity invoked as an isolated moral term in favor of the right to die fits only too well with secular bioethics that has moved beyond good and evil. To turn a phrase from Wittgenstein, even if cheaply, If you want to understand the meaning of a term, we should look at its use. And that's what we'll set out to do in this presentation on so-called death with dignity. We'll treat physician-assisted suicide like a sort of moral and theological Rorschach test, and we'll show that ink blot to bioethics to ask about its form, and primarily to do this through looking at its primary purported method, that is principalism. Through the language of the four principles, I argue the good death usually envisioned by bioethics, an autonomous death with dignity, tacitly subscribes to Nietzsche's Overman, a proud death when it is no longer possible to live proudly, proving one's triumph over God, morality, and nature. In other words, the Overman's freely chosen death might just as well be the good death. And so I'm going to argue that the form of bioethics after God appears to use its clout to justify overcoming death through the triumph of autonomy, and it transforms the right to die into rights for dying. According to Albert Johnson, bioethics emerged after World War II as an amorphous expression of concern about breakthroughs in medical technology, taking form into a coherent discourse and discipline divergent from medical ethics. Part of its novelty, Johnson goes on to say, was to force physicians and all of society to relativize traditional Western, that is Catholic and Protestant Christian, commitments for respecting life via absolute prohibitions on abortion and euthanasia. In the beginning of bioethics in the 60s, there was briefly a diversity of methods and possible breadth to the new field. However, looking back, it's clear that the Georgetown model of applying secular moral philosophy to medicine won out in the vestments of principalism. The 1979 Belmont Report provided proof of concept, and it did so on a public stage by bringing together rural utilitarians like Tom Beecham and rural deontologists like James Childress to collaborate by ignoring deeper epistemic and theoretical commitments. The report concretized bioethics as a consensus-generating philosophical activity, seeking to bridge diverse positions in secular language, though many have argued its three principles were just a post hoc backfilling to justify practices long done by scientists. Nonetheless, translating interminable ethical debate into a secular lingua franca seems the singular achievement of the new bioethics profession. Bioethics could claim to solve ethical problems by offering an unbiased, quasi-scientific discourse, and bioethicists could become the moral compass for the new technological medicine. They were installed as the conscience of modern medical schools. Few, if any, have done this better than Beecham and Childress, whose dogmatic work, Principles of Biomedical Ethics, continues to thrive in its 8th edition and remains a staple on medical board exams. The new medicine at last had a new ethic in principalism, or at least it had an easy-to-apply language whereby secular bioethics could encourage scientific progress. Dan Callahan summarized the field well. Quote, "Almost from its start, bioethics has been a child of its time and a child of good fortune at that. In his 1954 book, Medicine and Morals, Joseph Fletcher ventured the idea of personal choice as the highest moral value, and the struggle against nature as medicine's most liberating mission. That was a bold combination at the time, but it turned out to have been prophetically popular. And by the late 60s, its force was becoming apparent not only in medicine, but in the fledgling field of bioethics. Physician-assisted suicide demonstrates this as well as any issue. There we see that autonomy has always been the principle of the principles. In a 2006 paper, which we'll examine, Tom Beecham rightly labels the right to die as the triumph of autonomy. He gives voice to an oft-repeated narrative, noting that, quote, physician involvement in hastening the death of a patient, now often pejoratively termed physician-assisted suicide, is one dimension of a much larger struggle over patients' rights and physician control in the context of civil rights, women's rights, and consumer movements. Informed consent has long been central to biomedical law and ethics, of course, to protect patients from heteronymous physicians responsible for injustices like Tuskegee. However, Beecham takes a further step in envisioning the doctor-patient relationship primarily as a power struggle, where doctors ought to content themselves with enabling patient preferences of when and how they want to die. Though euthanasia has been an issue in medicine from ancient times, renewed amidst early 20th century eugenics and the Nazi regime, Beecham sees the advent of patient autonomy as initiating a new right-to-die movement, discontinuous with older ones. He glosses a number of prominent statutes and judicial rulings as a move that reorients end-of-life law and ethics around autonomy. Initially, this was via a general consensus that a patient or a surrogate has the right to refuse treatment and be allowed to die, but not to hasten death and be killed. This consensus dissolved, however, via a series of federal court rulings on assisted suicide in the 90s. Now, according to Beecham, state laws such as the Death with Dignity Act define, quote, the cutting edge of the history of the right to die. The final guardrail on that edge, he says, is an outdated distinction between killing and allowing to die. For Beecham, we ought now to recognize, quote, autonomous choice is not only a relevant consideration in understanding the difference between killing and letting die, it is the most relevant consideration. The consequences are the same, and the physician plays an important role in a causal chain in both cases. The distinction should not stand in the way of patient choice. And he seems to imply that the principle of autonomy bears the standard of moral progress. It's important here to ask and clarify what is really meant by autonomy in the first place. Is this Kantian autonomy? No, Beauchamp doesn't mean that one ought to perceive the objective demands of the moral law and choose rationally according to it. Is this simply the price that we pay for a content-less, metaphysically thin kind of aspirations of political liberalism? No, again. Rather, the triumph of autonomy that in American bioethics desired by Beauchamp is closer to a kind of vision of the autonomous man given by Dworkin. It's kind of autonomy that serves as a psychological descriptor where preferences, desires, the self, and life plans are central. The autonomous man is master of himself and directs his own life, proving his autonomy through a lifetime of autonomous acts. He accepts no heteronomy, including that of a Kantian moral law. Beauchamp sets up a dichotomy between the autonomous man and the Western moral tradition, urging American law and policy to allow individuals to break through and transcend its own encrusted history. Perhaps this is simply symptomatic of an ad hoc approach to law and policy at the end of life, as Carter Snead implies, where the only conceptual tool available is an impoverished sense of liberty and privacy. And perhaps in our liberal tradition, we're tempted to fall back on autonomy as a panacea. At any rate, patients for whom assisted suicide is to be made an option seemingly are to demonstrate their freedom from traditional morality in an autonomous death, which of course is really a proxy for bioethicists to demonstrate their own freedom from morality and ties them into a cultural revolution against the Western Christian endowment. In such a mode, which I argue has been a primary mode for bioethics since its birth, the field attempts to move history through the genealogy of morals. Doing so hopes to motor the rolling cultural revolution in this country at last beyond repressive moral norms that constrict human freedom. Indeed, such a mode does not only widen the field of free choice at the end of life, it also motors medicine in the terminally ill beyond nature and the indignities of natural death to achieve a true right to die. In short, bioethics encourages liberal individuals shorn from religious, cultural, and local tradition to assert their wills against the indignities of death and dying, moving the field beyond good and evil. Bioethics has set itself against alleged medical paternalism and Christian morality, such that some have called it the foundation myth of bioethics. This myth allows bioethicists doubly to accuse physicians of anti-liberal paternalism and Christian moral positions of backwardness. Doing so, they poise themselves as advocates of patient rights. How did secular bioethicists gain the high ground, you might ask? In the wake of cultural, religious, and social changes in medicine around the 1960s, there was a desire for canonical moral experts, for which the Belmont Report and Principles of Biomedical Ethics seemingly delivered. They promised to guide healthcare in replacement of religious authorities, and this constituted nothing less than the baptism of a field and the ordination of its practitioners. For Engelhardt, bioethicists have proven effective conceptive ideologists in the manner described by Marx and Engels. They articulate a sustaining myth, in both senses of a guiding narrative and a false story for the ruling class, and while concealing their own lack of grounding and moral pluralism in the way. They're politically useful in gaining social control over a significant domain of human society in order to articulate and impose a particular content-rich moral viewpoint, as if it were a universally binding morality. Such a guiding myth is symptomatic of a field in society after God. Examining the discourse on assisted suicide shows that the transcendent questions of moral theology have surely been evacuating of their meaning and content, leaving an immanent skeleton in its place that seeks to blandly maximize autonomy at the end of life. And Engelhardt's helpful here. Quote, "We are after God. That is, the dominant secular culture is deaf and blind to God's existence. The result is that in eschewing a God's eye perspective, morality, bioethics, the state, and the meaning of life are all approached as if everything came from nowhere, were going nowhere, and for no enduring and ultimate purpose." Elsewhere, he says, our Western culture has been replaced by a culture in which nothing has ultimate meaning. And this side of the rupture from the possibility of ultimate orientation, reality and secular morality are not just intractably plural, but in the end fundamentally meaningless. The meaning of secular morality and bioethics needs to be radically reconsidered. Secular bioethics for Engelhardt lies locked within the horizon of the finite and immanent. After God, there is no more moral ought, as Anscombe said, to provide ahistorical, universally binding moral prescriptions. We're left with a plurality of socio-historically contingent narratives promising to offer moral direction. And it's not controversial to say the liberating morality of many bioethicists merely reflects the communal opinion among liberal Western elites. Given such a plurality of contingent moral narratives, though, one's choice among them appears just like a sort of macro lifestyle choice that lacks binding appeal on all persons. And so we can say that the significance of morality is drastically deflated. Further, traditional moral concerns like the good death are considerably demoralized to non-moral ones. Sin, judgment, eternal life, the good, or even choosing the right at the end of life lose their meaning and are typically reinterpreted through the lens of authenticity. As such, the end of life becomes little more than a playground to enact one's desires and preferences. Desires and preferences not rooted in nature, but simply in the self. It's fair to say that moral judgments largely become aesthetic matters of taste. They're one's individual, idiosyncratic style for living and for dying. Of course, one can't live without any coherent narrative of moral values. It's basically impossible to live as a faithful nihilist. By default, though, in a post-Enlightenment context, liberty balloons to fill such an ethical vacuum, and we come to believe that freely choosing to enact our preferences autonomously becomes the source of morality in bioethics. It allows us to build a moral lifestyle not from a foundation in God, being, or reason, but in the individual itself. In a society after God accustomed to self-legislating moral lifestyles, the authority of autonomy in bioethics inevitably becomes the principle of the principles. It is taken for granted that an individual ought to be free, not to discover a good death united to a transcendent moral law, but to create their own authentic death style, to make the deathbed a sort of work of art that projects their self's preferences out into the world. And it becomes almost obvious that bioethics ought to enhance patient rights and empower choice against heteronymous, undignified ways of dying. McIntyre sees rightly that such individualism contemns oneself to the moral solipsism which constitutes Nietzschean greatness. Indeed, quote, the Nietzschean stance turns out not to be a mode of escape from or an alternative to the conceptual scheme of liberal individualist modernity, but rather one more representative moment in its internal unfolding. The autonomous man participates not only in the narrative of liberal modernity, which today is a narrative of atomized wills seeking to enact their desires as strangers, but in that of Nietzschean genealogy of morals. The autonomous man imagined by bioethics tastes death beyond good and evil. Being after God, he is also after morality. So long as reason retains its pride of place in moral discourse, we remain short of Nietzsche's moral philosophy, of course, and Bishop certainly does not have Nietzsche's aesthetic vision. However, using physician-assisted suicide as a sort of Rorschach test shown to bioethics, it seems to be that physician-assisted suicide is just an opportunity for the autonomous man to overcome traditional Western morality in favor of his own subjective taste and demonstrate his triumph through autonomous death. Killing oneself, in other words, follows Nietzsche in killing God. The death of God, famously proclaimed by Nietzsche's madman, is not a synonym for unbelief or for common atheism. What it means is rather the loss of a supersensory, a transcendent realm and a following reordering around the individual will. It ushers in a new generation, the final generation in the genealogy of morals, to present a new way of being for the race of men after the death of God, such that the authority of the self replaces God in the transcendent realm. The highest values devalue themselves to be replaced by alternative, constructed, immanent ones. At its center, the self-assertive subject completes nihilism in revaluing all values, which means the self becomes a true autonomous lawgiver to itself. This is the will to power. And the death of God, in other words, is a proclamation of faith in man as God. Nietzsche himself did not condone suicide as a pessimistic denial of life, but his prophet Zarathustra rather preaches free death at the right time to be the crowning achievement of life. He proposes a sort of meaningful death reminiscent of a classical hero. Quote, I show you the death that consummates, a spur and a promise to the survivors. He that consummates his life dies his death victoriously. To die thus is best. And he elaborates further in Twilight of the Idols, quote, to die proudly when it is no longer possible to live proudly. Death freely chosen, death at the right time, brightly and cheerfully accomplished amid children and witnesses. Then a real farewell is still possible, as the one who is taking leave is still there. Also a real estimate of what one has achieved and what one has wished, drawing the sum of one's life, all in opposition to the wretched and revolting comedy that Christianity has made of the hour of death. Here it is important to defy all the cowardices of prejudice and to establish above all the real, that is, the physiological appreciation of so-called natural death, which is in the end also unnatural, a kind of suicide. One never perishes through anybody but oneself. But usually it is a death under the most contemptible conditions, an unfree death, death not at the right time, a coward's death. From love of life, one should desire a different death, free, conscious, without accident, and without ambush. The sovereign individual who, according to Nietzsche, is liberated from morality of custom, who is autonomous and supramoral, affirms freedom and will supremely in voluntary death. Natural death is irrational, he says, as it is subject to the body. Moreover, it is linked to a religious worldview requiring one to submit themselves to a higher reason. Suicide, though, shows freedom over the body for Nietzsche. It shows freedom over death, and it shows freedom over Christian morality. Coming to a close here, assisting suicide through medicine is seen in the light of what I've said here. It seems to offer a bolus of strength to demoralized, weak-willed patients. It offers them the kind of free death normally only possible for the strong in spirit imagined by Nietzsche. The possibility of suicide, as many patients say at the end of life, is itself a comfort. By strengthening such spirits, the spirit understood as autonomous willing, lethal prescriptions appear to be a kind of postmodern spiritual therapy even, that seek to overcome the contingencies of the body for a dignified, autonomous death. Dutch euthanasia physician Herbert Cohen is fond of emphasizing this. Quote, "I like the spiritual to play a role," he says. It should not be a strictly medical event where the patient at the center of it is forgotten. It should be a solemn ceremony, a liturgy, he says. After God, the human spirit of self-assertion ought to fill the sacred role to inscribe death with meaning. And new rites are needed for the last men to celebrate their overcoming vitality and individual triumphing over death, all in assisted suicide. So, the good death usually envisioned by bioethics, an autonomous death with dignity, approaches Nietzsche's Overman. That's what I've argued. And the form of bioethics at the end of life thus appears to use its clout to bend public discourse toward becoming the masters and creators of our own morality. It works to overcome death and kill God through the triumph of autonomy.
Are we going to go each and then questions at the end?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to go through all the presentations, and then we'll save the questions till the end.
First of all, I should, in the interest of full disclosure, I don't have any financial thing. But I'm also no longer hold the Scanlon chair. And I only say that because my colleague Tom Harmon now holds the Scanlon chair, and he's also at this conference, right? So if you're like, oh, wait a minute, but we met the Scanlon chair over there. Anyway, so that would be, and also my dean and VPAA are also here. Anyway, and so I wouldn't like, did you tell them? Anyway, okay. So the Scanlon Foundation has been wonderful. They're a great thing, and Tom Harmon's even better. So anyway, but I'm not Scanlon chair. In a forthcoming book, From Here to Eternity, Reflections on Death, Immortality, and the Resurrection of the Body, I attempt to show how the revelation of the risen Christ helps us understand the connection between this life and the next. I argue that by entering the triune communion of love with the risen Christ in the general resurrection of the body, and thus entering into the communion of saints, we do not lose ourselves or our loved ones. Rather, we become more ourselves, more who we are meant to be, more loving and more able to give ourselves fully to those we love, wherever they may be in time and space. But facing death is not merely an intellectual challenge to be addressed by books. Death is a challenge to one's very existence, and it leaves no part of us, physical, emotional, or spiritual, unaffected. Darkness looms, and if ever there is a time when it becomes necessary to walk by faith and not by sight, it is in the face of death. Understanding the Lord's promise of the resurrection of the body and eternal life can, one hopes, help calm certain fears and provide needed hope. But we cannot allow the promise of eternal life, revealed by Christ's victory over death, to become merely a nice story we tell the dying to console them as we tuck them away out of sight. We must live our faith in Christ's victory as an ever-present reality, just as the risen Christ is an ever-present reality. We are called upon to live in the presence of the risen Christ and the communion of the saints every day, especially when dying or when those we love face death. The Bible portrays death as an enemy, but an enemy that has ultimately been overcome, even though its dark influence still pervades the world. So how can we live with death in truth and gain the wisdom we need about the limits of this life without becoming morbidly obsessed by death? The way to live with it, I suggest, would be not to ignore death or shut it away from us in closed rooms, but to live with it in union with the body of Christ. The most potent way we enter into union with the risen Christ is in the Mass and in the sacraments of the Church. In the liturgy, we make ourselves one with his death and resurrection. But may I suggest that a healthy Christian community would also engage in other practices to help prepare people for death. Prepare them, that is, without causing them to obsess over death or devalue the importance of life, which I think is very, very important that we not do. Some years ago, a friend turned to me during the funeral ceremonies at church, actually it was the Basilica on campus here, and said, "They do death well here." And indeed they had. Everything from the viewing of the body, the greeting of the family, and the rosary to the funeral itself was held in the church, in the Basilica. Everything was undertaken in view of the altar, the crucifix, and Christ present in the tabernacle. And there was a deep sense of prayer and respect. Sadly, it seems to me, many Christian communities in the modern world have forgotten how to bury their dead. When a church does death well, there is a sense of remembrance without having to go into all the details of the person's life. There is a clear sense that the person belonged, that he or she was an important part of the community, that something is missing now. But we carry on nonetheless because theirs was a life dedicated to this community. So when we carry on their good work, not merely getting on with our day, and dedicate our lives to the community he or she served, caring for his or her children and grandchildren, tending the garden, building up the institution in the same spirit with the same vision, then we remain united with them and they with us. This sense of connection is fostered by and ultimately must be grounded in, I suggest, belief in the communion of saints. When those we love die, we do not simply lose them. We gain an ever deeper communion with them in and through the union we have with them in Christ. Christ's resurrection and the doctrine of the general resurrection reveal that our actions, experiences, and relationships are not simply lost or negated with death. They are glorified. Those united with Christ can be present as Christ is present. They are no longer limited by time and space. But Christians believe in a resurrection of the body, not a freeing of a Gnostic spirit imprisoned in a body. Orthodox Jews and Muslims share with Christians a belief in the resurrection of the body. This is why Orthodox Jews and Muslims insist on burying their dead. They do not burn the bodies and put the ashes in a box on a shelf and then say to visitors, "We haven't quite decided what to do with that yet." Too many Christian communities have forgotten how to bury their dead or why it's important. To restore its place in the community, the church should once again take responsibility for burying the dead. All the messy, often distressing business that people have to go through to bury their loved ones when they are deep in grief should be handled by the church. What often now takes place in quote-unquote funeral homes, things that are very often the farthest thing you can imagine from a home, would happen in the church. The wake, the rosary, the greeting of the loved ones, probably even the potluck meal. The church should provide the services and then provide the space for burial near the church. We should restore the practice lost in the 19th century of burying our dead in the churchyard or nearby graveyard. People shouldn't have to travel miles on special occasions to visit the resting place of their loved ones in some potter's field somewhere. They should be able to pass by the visible symbol of their continued presence on the way to Mass, so the members of the community can be united with their predecessors continually in this way every day. They should find solace in the fact that they too one day will rest with those who came before them. Even the atheist poet Philip Larkin understood the importance of the presence of the classic churchyard with the graves of the dead. In his poem Churchgoing, Larkin says of a church he visits that, although he cannot understand what goes on inside, he recognizes that a church is a place, quote, proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. Seeing graves in the churchyard reminds those entering the church of the limits to their lives on this earth and of Christ's victory over death. The context also reminds the faithful of their debt to past generations and of what they owe future generations. Recall the beauty of Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, in which the poet exhorts passers-by beholding the graves, quote, "Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. For the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, warns Hardy, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave." But the poem, much of it steeped in melancholy, ends thus: "Approach and read the lay, graved on the stone beneath yon aged thorn. Here rests his head upon the lap of earth, a youth to fortune and fame unknown. Fair science frowned not on his humble birth, and melancholy marked him for her own. Large was his bounty and his soul sincere. Heaven did a recompense as largely send. He gave to misery all he had, a tear. He gained from heaven, 'twas all he wished, a friend. No farther seek his merits to disclose, or draw his frailties from their dread abode. There they alike in trembling hope repose, the bosom of his Father and his God. People young and old report that they visit cemeteries regularly, saying they find it spiritually comforting. Here at Notre Dame, for example, there's a cemetery for the Holy Cross Fathers along the road that leads from the grotto to St. Mary's College. Many people stop there to pray. Such places help put things into perspective, people tell me, and reminds them of what is truly important in life. Few things have been more depressing for me to hear, therefore, than the reply of a diocesan official to a friend's proposal to restore parish churchyards. Quote, "The Archbishop is opposed to parish churchyards," he said. "It makes it more difficult to close a parish." I thought that if parishes learned of this, they might immediately bury the next several parishioners who die in their churchyard, just to stake their claim, as it were, like the homesteaders of old. We're here to stay, thank you very much. Be that as it may, a healthy Christian community should, in my view, be attending, accompanying, and supporting the dying, just as they would also be attending, accompanying, and supporting fellow members in all the other stages of human development: birth, baptism, marriage, and burials. It is not well known now, but there used to be entire liturgical rites and Gregorian chants the communities would use to accompany the dying and ease their passing from this life to the next. Allow me to point to the important work of Dr. Elaine Stratton-Hild, PhD in musicology, who has been engaged in a fascinating study of plainsong chants that different communities, not just religious communities, but lay communities, would use to sing to dying persons in the Middle Ages. There is a link on the Notre Dame website to a video introducing her work. I suggest you go see it. Elaine Stratton-Hild. These communities shared the conviction that no one should have to die alone without the love and support of the community of believers to care for both their bodily requirements and their emotional and spiritual needs. After hearing Dr. Stratton-Hild talk about her research, a woman who had for a time been a novice with the religious community told the story of how, when a certain bell sounded in the community, everyone would stop whatever they were doing and come to the room of the dying sister. The sisters, spilling out into the hallway, would then sing a chant to accompany the person on their way. I was privileged some years ago to participate in a Melkite memorial service for a woman's father who had died. It was sad, but beautiful and deeply moving. The only tragedy was that the man couldn't be there to experience it. And I don't mean that as a joke, like the old saying about someone being late for their own funeral. What I mean is that I can imagine few things more beautiful and consoling to a dying person than to experience this sort of liturgy. Most of us in the modern secularist world have, it seems, forgotten how to deal with the dying. Our tendency is to lock the dying person away in a room so that no one can see this failure of our modern technology. The one thing every dying person I've ever known has wanted is to die at home. Not one of them did. And in a hospital, the likelihood of a person getting music, chant, a communal liturgy, or the simple presence of friends and family around the clock is nearly non-existent. For good reasons, but the medical community has an invaluable role to play in treating the dying, but it is only a part. Too often we have allowed ourselves to be atomized by modern culture into little separate units. And when we do that, we have no power against the institutions that promise to care for us, but which are increasingly threatening us. No one should have to die alone in the hospital, far from home. We need to recover the liturgies and communal practices of the church used for centuries to comfort the dying and console their families before society decided it was a medical issue. We do violence to the human person when we fail to understand the importance and value of eating and talking with others, of laughter, appropriate touching, music, singing, and the loving presence of friends, family, and community. This is true during our healthy years, but it is no less true with the dying. A respect for the integrity of the dying would begin, of course, long before a person enters into the actual process of dying. A healthy Christian community would begin by instilling respect for the elderly among all the members of the congregation and of society. In such a community, aging would be seen not as a disease, but as the natural and healthy course of life, which makes possible new birth and the passage of the generations. Death is not a human failure. It It is a natural end of human life. Christ called upon his followers to understand that, quote, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a seed. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Later, St. Paul would write that, quote, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. If this is still our faith, then we need to surround people with repeated expressions of that faith as they approach their final journey. In the scriptures, as I said, death is not portrayed as a desirable reality. It is dark, frightening, and it at least seems to threaten our very existence. One lesson we might take from the Christian understanding of death and the afterlife is that death will always, in one sense at least, seem unnatural. We often perceive it this way, as something not quite right, and we are not wrong in this. Many of us believe in some sort of immortality of the human person, while not quite understanding how or why this might be possible. So too, on the Christian view, death and decay are in one sense unnatural. They are the result of our fallen state, not part of what God in the Genesis creation account called good, very good. They are consequences of sin and made necessary by sin, because to eat the tree of life while still mired in sin would not be eternal happiness, but everlasting pain, frustration, and suffering. Biblical revelation in the church's teaching can help us make sense of why we sometimes think of death as somehow unnatural, not the way things were meant to be. In this life, we can understand and appreciate the emotion behind lines like these from Robert Frost's poem, Reluctance. Ah, when to the heart of man was it ever less than a treason to go with the drift of things, to yield with the grace to reason, and bow and accept the end of a love or a season. Or, of course, these famous lines from the poet Dylan Thomas, who wrote them to his dying father. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Both poets have captured something authentic in human experience. Christian teaching does not negate these experiences of attachment to life. Rather, it helps us understand this attachment more fully and put that desire in its proper context. The Christian teaching about the afterlife, properly understood, would in no way cause us, I suggest, or should no way cause us, to diminish the value of this life. Quite the contrary. We should value it as a precious gift of love from God. And as such, it is, in an important sense, not ours to do with as we wish. We do not give ourselves life, so we do not have the authority to take it. To throw it away or risk it needlessly would be unworthy of the gift and the giver. Life is a good thing, a very good thing, as the book of Genesis assures us. But more life without earthly death is not necessarily a good thing. It can, in fact, be a very bad thing, both for the individual and for the community. We yearn for something that preserves our sense that the spark of spirit and life cannot be snuffed out, but that also allows openness to the coming of future generations, a view that both connects us meaningfully to the generations that came before us and helps us to look forward lovingly to the generations that will come after us, without somehow making us cease to care about living in the present. The Christian promise of death and resurrection reveals that in Christ, we can preserve both the individual spark of life that we sense somehow should not be touched by death, and a world that remains continually open to new life. Thank you very much.
Wonderful to be with all of you this morning, and I look forward to our conversation. You know, in reflecting on the last two talks, particularly Dr. Smith's talk, I have a 98-year-old grandfather who has congestive heart failure, who's dying, but he's dying in my parents' home, and they're taking care of him, and they have meals with him, and it's just, I mean, they're far away from me. They're out in Seattle, Washington, but it's really beautiful to see and sort of enact what you're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And there's incredible dignity in his death. In fact, he was hospitalized, and I won't take up much time. He was hospitalized, and the doctors, without going into detail, told my parents and his children that he would never walk again. So he would be bedridden. He is, in fact, walking now without a walker through our house. For whatever that's worth, doctors are wonderful, but even just the power of that human connection and relationship can defy what we think should happen. So anyways, I will transition on to my topic, which is protecting the dignity of unrepresented patients with intellectual disabilities. So this is the beginning of my research on this topic, so I welcome your feedback of areas to investigate further, comments, questions you have, so thank you in advance. So my talk will proceed as follows. First, I will introduce the problem of unrepresented patients, what decision-making is involved for these individuals, some recent policy statements that have been made. There is a significant amount of research on this area, so I'll highlight that. And then I'll transition into talking about persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and some of the challenges they pose to traditional ways of making decisions for unrepresented patients. Then I will propose a second personal relational approach as a path forward for thinking about how to help these individuals make decisions at the end of life. And then I'll consider the role of subsidiarity, spheres of subsidiarity for thinking about this issue. So first, who are the unrepresented? So the unrepresented are persons who either lack decision-making capacity, perhaps they had an injury that prevents them from exercising their decision-making capacity. That's typically what happens. They lack a surrogate decision-maker, so perhaps they don't have an advance directive, they haven't identified anyone to decide on their behalf, which is the second point there. Or it could be a combination of the three. As Thaddeus Pope says, there is no one with whom the clinician can engage in shared decision-making, which is recommended for important value-laden decisions, right, particularly at the end of life. So more specifically, people who are unrepresented typically come from, or we can group them into three different areas. So people who are homeless or who have some mental illness, people who have intentionally broken off from family or friends for whatever reason, and then the elderly who outlive family or friends. And this is becoming an increasing problem for the elderly. According to Karp and Wood, unrepresented patients represent the single greatest category of problems encountered by hospitals and medical professionals. There are estimates of between 70,000 and 330,000, right? Large difference there, of these individuals, and this is rising. So according to 2017 data, the number of unrepresented patients is likely to increase, in part due to the baby boomer generation growing older, with fewer caregivers to take care of them and decide for them. There are increasing numbers of elderly with dementia as well, and seniors who are living alone. The most common location of encounter with unrepresented patients is in critical care units, or the ICU, where decisions about, say, the withdrawal of life support are most acute. But they could also be seen in non-ICU units where we're making decisions about intubation, feeding tubes, or other means of extending their life in ways that are quite invasive to them. You can see some stats here. 37% of unrepresented patients, physicians encountered them and considered removing life-sustaining treatment. And these individuals made up 16% of admitted patients to the ICU. So it's a surprisingly high number, actually, of people that we're encountering. And then 3% of nursing home residents are unrepresented, which seems small, but when we think about how many people are in nursing homes, this is actually a quite large number. So how does decision-making take place? When urgent medical decisions need to be made for unrepresented patients, there's frequently no clear guidelines for clinicians. The procedure that's recommended for decision-making for the unrepresented depends on a few things. So this is why there's no clear guidelines, right? So it depends on the state where the hospital is located, whether the hospital cares for military veterans, has a role, and why the individual is represented or unrepresented in the first place. Sorry, so are they mentally ill? That has a different set of guidelines. Do they have an intellectual and developmental disability? That has different guidelines. And we designate different decision makers or procedures than someone who's, say, socially isolated or elderly. And institutional policies about third-party involvement in decision-making, so going to a social worker or, say, a chaplain, like in Texas, is also part of the a factor, right, whether they have these options in place. And then, of course, the type of decision being made makes a difference. Is it a DNR? Is it a withdrawal of life support or something else? But ultimately, there's no consensus on the proper solution for how to make decisions for these individuals. There are 3 standard approaches, and then, of course, the combination approach, right, a tiered approach. So I'll just talk through each of these quickly. The physician approach, Court Wright is someone who supports this, and the idea here is that the physician would consult with an ethics committee in place, but they argue that the physician is better situated to decide for the patient, that in practice, decision-making actually for unrepresented patients goes to the physician sort of by default, right? They're closest, they're caring for the patient, and so sometimes they just make that decision, particularly in the ICU. And according to one study, only 11% of decisions by the physician, were made in consultation with an ethics committee or with the court. And then in another study, it was a little bit higher, 19% were made in consultation. So even if there's an ethics committee in place, the physician may or may not actually consult with the ethics committee. So that's the physician approach. The ethics committee approach is supported by Thaddeus Pope and others. And here, the idea is that we have a middle ground between the clinician or the physician making the decision for the patient, which has some issues which I'll highlight next, and then with some third party who is totally disconnected from the patient. So the ethics committee is supposed to be a sort of middle option for this. And then the legal approach, here we have a court-appointed guardianship that can take place. Now, it's not evident that this approach is ever preferred. It's mainly seen as a last resort to get the court involved. At Court Wright and others indicate, with no clear and shared policy across states, the common approach is that the medical team will initiate legal processes to request a court-appointed legal guardian in the event that there are no other possible surrogates. So sometimes there is a search done to see if there are any possible surrogates to help make these decisions. And then the tiered approach is one that's also supported by White and others. Here, the idea is a multifaceted approach, so you incorporate perspectives other than the clinicians. The idea here is that the authority for decisions should be with someone other than the treating clinician, and perhaps someone not encumbered by relationships with the institution and the clinicians involved in the case. So the physician can be an advisor, but just not the decider for the patient. So those are the standard options for decision making. There are problems with each of these, which you can probably anticipate. So the physician approach, some of the worries include is a very personal type of treatment that we're considering, right? End-of-life decisions are personal, not merely medical. Thus, they can present conflicts based on value judgments about the quality of life of the individual. It's tempting to put oneself in their own position. How would I want to end my life? And then, of course, the physician doesn't know the patient, right? An ethics committee approach has problems, too. There's a concern about groupthink. When dealing with conflicting value judgments, they also don't know the patient. The legal approach, the time and cost of these decisions, and guardians that are appointed by the court sometimes do not have the appropriate training to make these decisions for others, so that's a concern as well. And then with the tiered approach, simply the complexities of determining what's in the best interest of the person, which is a problem for all of these approaches as well. And then they don't know the patient, right? So a common theme here. There's been some encouraging progress made. Thaddeus Pope, along with a multidisciplinary committee, created a policy statement in 2020 to promote 5 ethical goals, which I'll share next, that aim to promote a balance between too much and too little procedural safeguards for incapacitated critically ill patients who are unrepresented. So here they have 5 ethical goals they wish to promote. They want to focus on specifically unrepresented patients in the ICU, so not other places one might encounter them. They suggest that we institute an interprofessional multidisciplinary committee to aid in decision-making process. And this is reflected from Pope's support for the ethics committee and tiered approach for decision making. So these are the 5 ethical goals: protect highly vulnerable patients, demonstrate respect for persons, safeguard against unacceptable discrimination, and avoid the completing obligations and conflicting interests, right, with the institution. Now, there are some limitations to this work. I think it's encouraging to see these goals being promoted in the work here, but some of the limitations are simply the scope of the focus, right? So some individuals are highly vulnerable prior to needing urgent medical care. So, for example, persons with dementia, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the elderly in nursing homes, are vulnerable prior to this situation. So how do we work with them? Some individuals' preferences are difficult to discern apart from being unrepresented. So there sometimes is an assumption that we can discern people's preferences prior to them becoming unrepresented. But for some individuals, it's difficult to discern because of communication difficulties. Some individuals lack the typical decision-making capacity or self-determination that we often take for granted when we make these policies, that someone could make an advance directive or an end-of-life decision prior to becoming incapacitated, but this is not true for everyone, or it can be harder for some individuals. One approach people often take is to revert to a best interest standard for treatment guidance. So what would be in the best interest of the patient? Now this makes sense, except that this often includes a maximizing benefit, minimizing burden sort of strategy, but these determinations are complicated by patients with disabilities or dementia, depending on how we determine what counts as benefit and burden, right? Because these individuals are arguably great burdens on the hospital and arguably society. And so that might mean less aggressive treatment for these individuals who otherwise might prefer to live. And then certain types of disabilities can present as decreasing the value or quality of an individual life, leading decision makers to assume they would prefer not to live. So this is a concern for the best interest standard. And in fact, there's evidence for this worry. A study surveying 714 practicing physicians revealed that over 80% of these physicians indicated that they thought people with significant disabilities have a worse quality of life than non-disabled persons. So there's reason to be concerned. All right, so persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's going to be the focus of the rest of my talk, present a challenge to the standard decision-making approaches to representation. According to Watson, Voss, and Bloomer, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience more incidents of life-threatening medical conditions than those without intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then whether represented or not, these individuals have limited capacity to communicate their preference to caregivers, surrogates, and decision makers in the first place. Little attention has been paid to such end-of-life planning in the lives of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then this next point, that people with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities had their end-of-life preferences taken into account only 2.9% of the time, according to one report. So even if they did indicate preferences with help from others, again, these prejudices sometimes come in to limit our enactment of their wishes. And then there's difficulty sometimes in communicating with these groups of individuals because of their atypical communication styles. So there's a need to reframe the way that we make decision. Let me just quote here. There's a need for reframing of the way that decision-making capacity is understood for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So here we move away from individual cognition and privileging that, and instead focus on levels of support and adjustments in order for these individuals to exercise their decision-making capacity. So I suggest a relational approach to decision-making that starts prior to the emergency and aims to prevent isolation, lack of information, and absence of relationships, right? So we're trying to prevent people from being alone in the first place, unrepresented in the first place. And to do this, I suggest that we form second personal relational networks of care and support. And this relational approach I think, contrasts to the more common person-centered approaches or communication-centered approaches. These approaches are good, but they often emphasize the capacities for autonomy and self-determination that seem to be inhibited or lacking in some of these individuals that I'm concerned with. So I suggest we develop these second personal relational networks. I won't go through all of these points, but essentially these networks are bidirectional and reciprocal. They are aimed at connecting with the person as a person, and this gives us a sort of unique type of knowledge of the person. And this comes through being with the other. So it takes time, it takes intentionality, it takes planning. But here we have a way to connect with the individual and more accurately grasp their desires and wishes and who they are through this maybe atypical way of communicating. So the common approach is to privilege communication empowerment. And though this approach often focuses on the non-intellectually and developmentally disabled, implementing steps and following processes to facilitate communication, right? So those of us without the intellectual and developmental disabilities need to figure out how to communicate with those who have them, rather than thinking about how do we listen to the communication that's already happening by those with the disabilities. So my proposal of using second-person relationships articulates the nature of the relationship needed for such communication facilitation to happen at all. It draws on our relational capacities as human beings and uses these social powers rather than rational powers to justify the use of relational approaches to decision making. So we start with the relational being, and then we can start discerning our preferences. So it's from these established relationships that we can communicate need, suffering, preferences, and respond to them best. So the starting point is not a test of capacity, but the presumption that every human being is and has been communicating with us. We just have to be there to listen and to be attuned to this communication. That might not be verbal. All right, so I know I'm going quickly. I'm going to try to get through the rest of this. So the relational approach that I'm offering reframes the notion of dignity to be rooted in our capacity for relationships, since this capacity is not something we can lose, in part because there's two people involved. So it's not up to me to be in a relationship. There's two people involved, at least. Thus, it squares with the view that dignity is something inherent in us, not something we gain or lose with our human powers or capacities. So moving forward, I think one way to try to remedy some of these situations is to widen the spheres of subsidiarity that we have. We can even think about Alistair McIntyre's notion of proxy. So to be a proxy, we need to be close to the individual to help represent their views, speak, how does he say, not to just speak to, but how to speak for the other out of these relationships. So I suggest that we start with family networks, those people closest to us, and then we start sort of zooming out, right? So local communities or organizations could help these individuals start articulating their preferences for end-of-life care, or at least getting to know the individual to help represent them. And then we could go to church or religious communities, social workers, and then finally the legal or medical profession personnel would be sort of the last resort in making these decisions. Now this is ideal, I recognize, but I think it's something that we start to see some examples of. So I've listed a few. So the last two, the Supported Decision Making New York, is a pilot project that's going on right now to help support decision making for people with disabilities. So it'll be interesting to see what they find with this pilot project. And then there are other examples of communities and organizations that are aiming to befriend and represent those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. All right, so I'll just conclude that here's a sort of visual of what I'm thinking about, right? So we have the individual, and then these are our spheres of subsidiarity, right? So we start closest to the individual. Ideally, they could make the decision, right, themselves, but in the event that they can't, we start as close as we can to them, and then we get far away. So that's my my proposal, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel to all our speakers. I'm just struck by how well these have all gone together, emphasizing different aspects of dignity and end-of-life care. So we have a rarity here, which is the actual full 15 minutes for questions. So at this point, if you have any, please. Yes.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is for Dr. Schimmeler. So I've heard that the Hippocratic Oath has now become the Declaration of Geneva. That there isn't, the doctors don't necessarily promise that they won't give any kind of deadly medicine anymore. I'm just wondering, does everyone really take the Declaration of Geneva? Is this still something, or is there something holding doctors accountable to not prescribing, not giving, medicine that allows for assisted suicide? So that's one. And then my other question, which is really for anyone in general, I think one of the arguments for assisted suicide euthanasia is the idea of compassion. It's like, well, this is, the best thing to do, the most compassionate thing to do. I find that idea of compassion to be really totally warped, because compassion is suffering with someone. And so invoking this idea of compassion, it really is turning our back to someone suffering, because in looking at someone suffering, you actually have to kind of affirm that you have to look at it, and therefore you participate in it. And so I would just say, like, why do you think there is, how has society taken on this idea of compassion, and how are they, how has it potentially been distorted in discourse nowadays?
Thank you.
So regarding the Hippocratic Oath and its place in modern medicine, especially modern medical education, Tom Koch, in his book on bioethics, talks, he kind of lays the blame at Beecham and Childress and among other of the early bioethicists, for waging war against Hippocratic medicine. And so the short answer to your question is, there is not, other than the law, there is not a much of a firm ethical commitment to, that holds physicians accountable at the end of life to not take the lives of their own patients. And there's various transgressive actions that have occurred and become very public as well, even when the law said one ought not do this. Most famous probably being Timothy Quill published, a very famous piece about taking the life of a certain Diane while it was still illegal, and was prosecuted and ended up in the Supreme Court for it. So there are oaths taken in medical school, but one wonders what the meaning of oath is when one takes it. And it is entirely self-constructed by medical students in a sort of democratic process, and does not really reflect or seek to bring apprentices into a sort of profession like like professions have traditionally been thought of. It seeks to give them an opportunity to express what it means to them personally to express being a physician, not what it means, not the yoke that they're taking on, so to speak.
For the second question.
Oh, yeah, if you want to say something about the second question. Yeah, here, you probably want to say something about the second question, don't you?
I can. You're.
We only have one thing here.
Yeah. So the question about compassion, and it's a great question, and I'm glad that you talked about sort of the meaning of compassion, right? To suffer with. My thinking about this is more just, I think we don't know how to. I think it's a couple things, right? We are afraid of pain and suffering, and we don't see it face to face very often, and so there's, I think, a fear. And also, if there's no hope beyond this life, then I think that also impacts our sort of the least we can do is honor their decision, or the least we can do is make sure they don't have pain. Although there are clearly other ways in which one can alleviate pain without ending the life. So, but I would be curious what other people. It's not a real answer, just more of my own thinking on these things.
Maybe we can turn it to other questions. Yeah. This gentleman.
We have a microphone here who would help out with the video.
Good.
Use this. So, Mark Cherry, Republic of Texas. And even though I'm loud, I'll use the microphone.
The first is just a general comment about death with dignity. The language of death with dignity and its attachment to the euthanasia movement is seen by many as a triumph of modern bioethics. I have an occasional conversation with someone who I will gently refer to as a serial killer in Canada who organizes the euthanasia for her area and has killed more than 20 people and thinks it's a wonderful thing. Mm-hmm. It's remarkable how that language is being used and twisted, and in fact it's being brought into churches, so more and more church goers in fact are participating in it. It's now more than 2% of all deaths in Canada are by active euthanasia. It's really remarkable. So just a general comment there. And for Professor Goodnight, I just had what I think of as a friendly amendment, or maybe you've already done it, just didn't have time to talk about it. What's interesting with individuals who are with intellectual disabilities is how individual each one really is, and how remarkably different they can be from each other. And in terms of sort of looking at frameworks for dealing with them, why relationships can actually be really important, especially those who know them immensely well. Because some are not really going to be able to communicate even in the ways that you and others that you're reflecting on are able to, in fact, they just can't do those kinds of things. So, I mean, the one I know the best, my baby sister, can't. And yet we know her well. And so that's why it's a real powerful sense of relationship that you're referencing there. And so just as a friendly sort of thought in terms of that scope, you might find useful. You probably already have done it, just a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that suggestion. That's a helpful way of putting it. So I appreciate that.
The gentleman here, would you mind speaking into the microphone so you can catch it on the video? Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers for your presentations. I thought that it seemed like a common theme between the presentations was this idea of dignity in a more relational sense rather than dignity as being able to self-legislate. And I thought that was really interesting because, I mean, I've studied the work of Stephen Darwell and also looked a bit at the literature on personalism. So I think those are two kind of encouraging schools of thought. But I do think with euthanasia, I had a conversation with someone who's actually written a lot about the euthanasia regimes in the Netherlands and Belgium the other day. And he, I suppose, would be opposed to euthanasia as a policy proposal, legalising euthanasia. But he did say in this conversation, and he's a religious person, like a fairly committed Christian, that he thinks that in individual cases, when you're suffering in a kind of unbearable way, and he's a physician and he gave a couple of examples. He said, like, I can see just from an ethical point of view, he thought like kind of how strong the intuition is there that you should let people end their lives because they're suffering so much. But then he said, like, on a kind of general policy level, it's a disaster, so we shouldn't legalise it. So I was wondering what you thought about that, because, I mean, I think in the end I agree with, I'm deeply sympathetic to everything that's been said, but I do think that for the general public, that intuition just drives people to express support for the proposal, so, yeah.
Yeah, can I just say something about that? And I'm just to start us off, which is to say, and going back to the original question, right, about compassion, it seems to me that all of these tend to be driven by a failure, right? In other words, same thing with abortion. Like, what happens? And the answer is, well, when you as a society have failed in all sorts of ways, right, to in terms of stability of marriages, in terms of support of people, in terms of taking care of young women who are in crisis pregnancies and various alternatives, well, then people want to sort of say, well, we can just take the easy way out, right? And they're like, so reacting to, right, I mean, the church is trying to get people to have this kind of relational understanding of the nature of the human person. And when you get this atomized society, well, then you get these crisis situations to which then the society's response is, well, we have to get rid of it. I mean, we have to deal with it. And this would be the way, this isn't quite getting to your question yet. But the point is, it seems to me in both cases, you're driving to this, right, precisely because what you should recognize, and maybe as a society should say, is the only reason we're really pushing for this is because we failed, right? We failed to show enough care and relation and, community with these people that this is the avenue they want to take. But as you've said, like, the word compassion means, as it were, kind of suffering with. All right, and that's the refusal of the society, right? Because again, we're an atomized society, and so it's kind of like, well, this would require us to actually care for, right, women in crisis pregnancies and their children, et cetera, and it would require us to care for people and medicate properly for death, but not only medicate, obviously, because there's other suffering, but to accompany them in various ways. We have to restore the church's understanding of the corporal works of mercy, where people have to actually I have to visit people in prison. I have to be with the people who are dying. I have to, this is something that I have to do rather than make more money, watch Game of Thrones. Again, it's like, this makes sense? So it's a thing where you're like, an atomized society simply doesn't have this sense that these are things which the church community, it seems to me, has the resources to say, like, what are you doing with your time, and to restore, again, to use McIntyre's maybe overused point, practices, right, that we should have, right, within the church, and people understand, right, rather than sort of saying we need another 4 people for Eucharistic ministers, which is a good thing, but the point is like, well, actually, why don't you just go visit, these people in nursing homes or something? Anyway.
We have a few more minutes, so I want to make sure I get to other questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, just as a brief clinical comment, there is dispute, and I'm not a hospice and palliative care doctor. However, I think most physicians would say that we could deal with most of the pain at the end of life, most of the somatic pain, at least, that is. And even in the cases where we can't relieve it, it's controversial. Most people accept it, at least in a limited sense. Palliative sedation is an option. That somatic pain, that doesn't get after psychological, existential sorts of spiritual pain of coming to grips with one's own mortality. And when it comes to compassion, for me, having that clinical context in place, I suppose compassion's place in the euthanasia movement, it seems more of an existential thing to me, in to use the overused line of relieving the human of the human condition. It's as a way to deal with the reality of being human, the way to deal with mortality as an easy solution to it.
In the back, the woman in the back, yes.
Thank you so much for these wonderful...
Would you mind speaking, into the microphone, just so we have it on the video? Thank you.
Thank you for your talks. I wanted to respond 2 things that really struck me. Dr. Smith, your comment about people dying in the hospital, versus at home surrounded by loved ones was really poignant. I am a hospice and palliative physician and clinical ethicist, and something I was thinking about in that comment also relates to the first speaker as well, where I think there's a lot of blessing with our medical technology, no doubt, and I'm overall very, very grateful for all the technologies that we have, but I think one of the challenges becomes knowing what the limits of medicine are and the finitude of that. And I think it's like a dual side of the conversation of when they're dying in the hospitals, they're not usually dying with like end of life care, so to speak. It's usually highly medicalized ICU care. And at some point the decision's made to make a transition, which is usually the death usually comes pretty quickly after that because of, the point of the person is at. And to the point about assisted suicide, what I did practice in a state where that was legal for a while. I don't currently. And what I experienced there was, anecdotally, I actually felt it put a burden on people that choice was legalized. And I actually worked with patients who came into the clinic really suffering, I felt, because that choice was in front of them, feeling that because it was a choice legally that they had to sort of contend with, would they be better off dead? And usually it was in the setting of, would the others around them be better off if they were dead? And I can give some really specific anecdotes about that, but I just won't right now just because of some maybe privacy. But those were my experiences. And so I guess just comments, and I want to thank you for what you guys are doing in furthering these important conversations.
Well, can we thank you for doing this really important service in palliative care, right? I mean, it strikes me that it's sort of like when people get on planes and we want to thank our veterans and stuff, and I do want to thank veterans, but I also want to thank people who engage in this really important end-of-life care, because I think this is very important. People I've known, actually, who didn't die at home but still had very, very caring palliative care people around them, and I've always been extraordinarily impressed by the work they do, and how not only professional they were, but how caring, deeply caring, and how good they were with the families. Because families don't really know how to deal with this, which is kind of sad, but I'm very pleased to hear this story. Of course, this is like, yay, you hear ladies, oh, that's so beautiful. But again, no, thank you so much for doing this work, which not so many people, who get into medicine sort of say to themselves, ooh, palliative care, I want, anyway, but thank you, really, and for your question. But
No, thank you for your comments. That's very kind.
Anybody want to respond to that? And we don't have any more time. But
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but maybe we can continue this conversation over lunch. Please join me again in thanking our